The mirror arrived at the estate in an unmarked crate, wrapped in layers of dusty burlap. Its origin was unclear, and its surface was unnaturally pristine despite the antique frame carved with grotesque figures, twisting bodies that seemed to writhe when you glanced at them. Evelyn had purchased it at a peculiar estate sale in a distant town, where the air smelled of mildew and regret. She hadn't gone looking for it, but the moment her eyes locked on the mirror, she felt an unshakable compulsion to bring it home. Evelyn placed the mirror in the hallway of her sprawling, creaky house, a mansion she had inherited but never truly loved. It was the kind of place where shadows lingered too long in the corners. And at night, the wind seemed to whisper her name through the drafty hallways. She told herself the mirror was just an object, a harmless piece of decor, but as she stared into it for the first time, she swore her reflection smirked a moment too late. That night, she dreamt of herself standing in front of the mirror. Her reflection grinned unnaturally, its eyes hollow pits leaking black sludge. In the dream, it reached out, the glass rippling like water as its hand passed through. Evelyn awoke gasping, her throat dry, her room colder than usual. She brushed off the dream, blaming it on her overactive imagination. Yet, as the days passed, the dreams grew more vivid, and the mirror's presence felt heavier, as though it was alive. Watching, the first tangible sign of its darkness came when Evelyn's cat, Jasper, went missing. She found him days later, his broken body sprawled at the foot of the mirror. His fur was matted with blood, his eyes wide with terror, as if he had seen something unspeakable. She tried to rationalize it, a wild animal must have gotten in, but deep down, she knew. The mirror had shown her Jasper's demise the night before in another dream. The image of her pet being torn apart played in her mind like a memory rather than a night's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She avoided the mirror, but its pull was magnetic. Whenever she passed it, she felt the urge to look, to confront whatever monstrosity lurked within. One evening, after a particularly oppressive day of whispers in her mind and fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures in the corner of her vision, she gave in. Standing before the mirror, she stared into her reflection. It stared back, but the longer she looked, the more it changed. Her face contorted, her skin peeling away to reveal raw, bleeding flesh beneath. Her eyes became bottomless voids, and her mouth stretched unnaturally wide as if preparing to scream. She tried to step back, but her feet wouldn't move. Her reflection extended a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and before she could scream, it grabbed her wrist. The room shifted around her. She was no longer in her hallway but in a twisted version of her home. The walls were blackened, pulsating with what looked like veins. The air was thick and choking, reeking of decay. Voices whispered in a language she couldn't understand, growing louder with every passing second. Her reflection stood before her, no longer confined to the glass. It smiled, a wicked, grotesque grin, and said, "You brought me here. Now it's my turn to live." The next few days were a blur of terror and confusion. Evelyn wandered through the warped version of her home, pursued by her doppelganger. It didn't just look like her, it knew her thoughts, her fears, her darkest secrets. It taunted her, replaying memories of her worst moments. She saw visions of herself committing unspeakable acts, drowning a child in a bathtub, setting fire to a house full of people, carving symbols into her own flesh with a jagged blade. She couldn't tell if these were things she had done or horrors the mirror was implanting in her mind. As days turned to weeks, Evelyn grew weaker. The mirror's world sapped her energy, feeding off her fear and despair. Tried to escape, but every door led her back to the same room, the mirror standing in the center, mocking her. She realized the mirror wasn't just a portal, it was a trap, a living entity that consumed the souls of its victims. In her final moments of clarity, Evelyn made a desperate decision. She found a shard of glass from the fractured world around her and drove it into her own reflection's chest. The creature howled, its form flickering and distorting, but as it fell, so did Evelyn. Blood pooled around her, and her vision darkened. When the police finally entered the house weeks later, responding to complaints from neighbors about a foul smell, they found Evelyn's lifeless body in the hallway. She was slumped in front of the mirror, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The mirror's surface was cracked, and from its jagged edges, faint whispers could be heard. One of the officers, drawn by morbid curiosity, reached out to touch the glass. As his fingers brushed the surface, his reflection smiled. The officer's fingers barely grazed the cracked surface before an icy chill surged through his arm. His hand froze in place, trembling, as if the mirror had latched onto him. His partner called his name, a distant echo in his ears, but he couldn't respond. The world around him seemed to dim, colors bleeding into shadow. The reflection of his face in the mirror twisted, his mouth stretched unnaturally wide. His eyes bleeding tears of black ichor. He tried to pull away, but the mirror refused to release him. His partner grabbed his shoulder and yanked him back. The connection broke with a deafening crack, and the officer collapsed to the floor, gasping. His hand was ice-cold and pale, veins darkened to an unnatural blue. He stammered something about hearing whispers, 1,000 voices screaming his name, but before his partner could get answers, the lights in the hallway flickered and died. The room descended into suffocating darkness, broken only emanating from the mirror. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of rot and mildew. The remaining officer fumbled for his flashlight, his heart pounding as the whispers began. They were faint at first, a soft chorus of indistinct voices, but they grew louder, more insistent, forming words in a language that felt older than time. The flashlight beam flickered to life, illuminating the mirror. The surface was no longer cracked, it had mended itself, its reflective surface smooth and gleaming. But what it showed wasn't the room. Instead, the reflection revealed a macabre scene, a dimly lit chamber filled with grotesque figures writhing in agony. They were human once. But their bodies were distorted, skin stretched taut over jagged bones, their mouths sewn shut, eyes wide with unending torment. Then the figures moved, turning their hollow gazes toward the officers. One pressed its malformed hand against the inside of the mirror, its flesh bubbling and peeling as it tried to break through. The officer holding the flashlight stumbled backward, his breath hitching as the whispers turned to screams. The figure's hand punched through the glass, shattering the illusion of separation. The shards rained to the floor, but instead of scattering, they hovered mid-air, twisting and spinning into jagged points that pulsed with malevolence. The shards flew at the officers. One was impaled through the chest, his body flung violently against the wall. His partner screamed, drawing his weapon, but the mirror was no longer just a mirror, it was alive, pulsating with energy, its frame writhing as though the carved figures were crawling out. The glass reassembled itself, rippling like water, and from its surface emerged a shadowy figure cloaked in darkness. The shadow being was neither human nor fully tangible. Its form flickered, its edges dissolving into smoke, but its eyes burned with an intensity that made the officer's blood run cold. It spoke, its voice a guttural rasp that seemed to echo inside his skull. More souls to feed, it hissed. The mirror hungers. The officer fired his weapon, but the bullets passed through the figure harmlessly, lodging into the wall behind it. The shadow surged forward, enveloping him in a suffocating darkness. He screamed as the shadow entered his body, his veins blackening, his eyes rolling back into his head. His mouth stretched wide in an unnatural grin before his body collapsed, lifeless. The house fell silent, the mirror once again still and intact, as if nothing had happened. But the atmosphere in the room had changed, it felt charged, alive, as if the house itself was watching. Days later, the mirror found its way into an auction house, marked as a rare antique with an ambiguous history. The curator, a sharp-eyed woman with a penchant for the macabre, couldn't resist its eerie charm. She placed it in the center of the showroom, unaware of the darkness she had invited. The first night it was displayed, the building's security cameras picked up strange disturbances. Footage showed faint, ghostly figures flitting through the room, their movements erratic and unnatural. At 3:33 a.m., every camera in the showroom failed simultaneously. When the morning staff arrived, they found the night guard hanging from the rafters, his face frozen in a mask of terror. His blood had been used to scrawl a single word across the mirror's surface, feed. The auction house dismissed the incident as a tragic accident, but the mirror's reputation grew. Buyers were drawn to it, enchanted by its dark allure, but none could explain the unease they felt in its presence. Over the weeks, the deaths began to pile up, and in turn found in the storage room with their eyes gouged out, a delivery driver who crashed into a tree after claiming to see something in the back seat, and a cleaner who vanished entirely, leaving behind only a bloodied mop. Red on their souls, its surface growing darker with each victim. Whispers of its cursed nature spread, but that only seemed to increase its appeal. Collectors of the occult vied for the chance to own it, their greed blinding them to the horrors they were unleashing. One such collector, a wealthy recluse named Victor Crane, won the bid. He had spent years amassing a collection of cursed artifacts, his obsession driven by a need to uncover the truth about life after death. He believed the mirror was the key, a doorway to the beyond. He had no idea that the beyond was already watching. Victor placed the mirror in his private study, a room lined with ancient tomes and relics of forgotten civilizations. That night, as he stared into the mirror, he saw not his reflection but a shadowy figure with burning eyes. The figure smiled, and the room plunged into darkness. The last anyone heard of Victor Crane was a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the house, carrying with it the promise of endless torment. When authorities arrived, the mansion was empty, save for the mirror, which now bore a single new addition to its frame, a small, grotesque carving of a man's face, frozen in a scream. The mirror remains out there, waiting for its next victim. It does not simply show reflections, it reveals the darkest corners of the soul, feeding on fear, despair, and death. Those who look too long into its depths will find themselves staring back from the other side. Their screams silenced, their souls trapped forever in its dark embrace. The mirror did not remain idle for long. It thrived on movement, on change, and on finding new prey. Its presence was like an infectious curse, whispering to those who came near, compelling them to bring it somewhere new. And so, it was transported, its carved frame wrapped in thick cloth and tucked into the corner of a delivery truck. The driver, a man named Rick, felt uneasy as he drove through the stormy night, marveling at how it seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. As she worked, she thought she saw movement in the reflection, just a flicker, like a shadow passing behind her. She spun around, but the shop was empty. The faint sound of rain tapping against the windows was the only noise. Dismissing it as her imagination, she continued working. But the movement in the mirror grew more persistent. This time, she saw herself, or something that looked like her. The reflection smiled, but Claudia hadn't. It tilted its head, observing her with a predatory curiosity. She backed away, her heart racing, as the reflection's grin widened unnaturally. The glass began to ripple like liquid, and her distorted image stepped forward. Claudia screamed as the reflection emerged, its form dripping and malformed, its face a grotesque mockery of her own. It reached for her, its fingers long and clawed, and she ran. She bolted through the boutique, her breath hitching as the lights flickered and went out one by one. The shadowy figure pursued her, its wet, slapping footsteps echoing through the dark. She tried to escape through the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure closed in, its guttural laughter filling her ears. Desperate, Claudia grabbed a heavy iron lamp from a nearby table and swung it wildly. The creature dissolved into smoke, but its laughter lingered. She turned, only to find herself face to face with another version of her reflection, this one taller. Gaunter, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. Before she could scream again, the mirror's glass shattered, shards flying through the air. They embedded themselves into her skin, slicing deep as a searing pain spread through her body. She collapsed to the floor, writhing as the shards burrowed deeper, their edges glowing faintly with an eerie light. Her screams faded into choking gasps, and then, next morning, the boutique was empty. Claudia was gone. The only sign she had ever been there was the bloodstain on the floor and the faint smell of decay. The mirror, now free of its coverings, stood in the center of the room, its surface gleaming as though freshly polished. Word of the mirror spread quickly after Claudia's disappearance. It was auctioned off yet again, this time to a reclusive artist named Dominic. He was drawn to its dark beauty, convinced it would be the centerpiece of his next masterpiece. He installed it in his studio, a dimly lit space cluttered with half-finished sculptures and paintings, but the mirror didn't just haunt Dominic. It inspired him. He began creating grotesque, nightmarish works, statues of twisted, screaming figures, paintings of shadowy landscapes where horrific creatures lurked. His friends noticed the change in him, the way his eyes seemed hollow, his skin pale and stretched. He stopped answering calls, stopped leaving his studio. The only thing he seemed to care about was the mirror. One night, unable to resist its pull, Dominic stood before it, chisel in hand. He saw himself reflected in the glass, but his reflection wasn't standing still. It mimicked his movements at first, then began carving into its own flesh with the chisel. Dominic watched in horrified fascination as the reflection's skin peeled away, revealing sinew and bone beneath. The reflection grinned at him, its teeth sharp and glistening, and began to carve symbols into the frame of the mirror. Dominic's hand moved involuntarily, his body controlled by an unseen force. He carved the same symbols into his own skin, his screams echoing through the studio. Blood pooled at his feet as he continued, unable to stop, until his body collapsed, lifeless. When the authorities found Dominic days later, the mirror was gone. Only his body remained, surrounded by his horrifying creations. Somewhere, the mirror was on the move again, seeking its It would not rest until it consumed every soul that dared to gaze into its cursed depths. The mirror resurfaced in an upscale mansion, acquired by a wealthy collector named Gregory Madsen. Gregory, an aficionado of rare and macabre artifacts, had heard whispers of the mirror's dark reputation. He dismissed the tales as superstitious nonsense, convinced its grotesque carvings would be a conversation starter at his frequent gatherings. It was positioned in his grand hall, mounted above a marble fireplace, casting an eerie presence over the room. On the night of its unveiling, Gregory hosted an extravagant party. The room buzzed with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of glasses as guests marveled at the mirror. Despite their outward admiration, many felt uneasy. Something about its reflective surface seemed wrong. It was too clear, too inviting, as though it waited for someone to step closer. As the evening wore on, one guest, a young woman named Evelyn, found herself inexplicably drawn to the mirror. She couldn't look away from her reflection. It wasn't just her image, it felt alive, its eyes holding hers with a mesmerizing intensity. The room seemed to fade around her, the voices of the other guests muffled and distant. Evelyn. A friend called, touching her shoulder. Evelyn snapped out of her trance and turned, shaken. But the reflection in the mirror didn't follow her movement. Instead, it remained still, staring at her with a wicked grin that spread unnaturally wide. Evelyn screamed, causing the music to stop and all eyes to turn toward her. The reflection lunged from the mirror. A blackened, clawed hand reached out, its nails glistening like onyx. Evelyn stumbled back, her heel catching on the rug, sending her sprawling. The hand withdrew as quickly as it had emerged, the reflection once again mimicking her every move as though nothing had happened. Guests erupted into chaos. Gregory, dismissing the incident as a trick of the light or Evelyn's overactive imagination, ushered her out of the room and instructed the guests to return to their drinks. But the mirror had already begun its work. That night, the mansion grew eerily quiet. The once lively halls were now consumed by a suffocating darkness. Gregory, alone in his study, poured himself a drink. His irritation with Evelyn's outburst faded into a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. The mirror's presence loomed in his mind, its grotesque carvings vivid in his memory. As he sipped his whiskey, Gregory heard a faint scraping sound. He set his glass down, his ears straining. The noise grew louder, closer, like nails dragging along wood. He grabbed the fireplace poker and stepped into the hallway, his breath clouding in the sudden chill. The mirror's reflection wasn't confined to the frame anymore. Shadows spilled from its surface, slithering like living smoke across the walls and floor. Gregory froze as his reflection appeared, stepping out of the mirror. Its face twisted with malice, its eyes glowing a deep crimson. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as the reflection whispered in a voice that wasn't his own, "You invited me in." Gregory stumbled back, swinging the poker wildly. The reflection laughed, its voice a cacophony of shrieks and growls. The shadows closed in, coiling around Gregory like serpents. He screamed as they tightened, pulling him toward the mirror. His reflection reached out, its hand phasing through the glass to drag him in. Gregory's screams echoed through the mansion as he was pulled into the mirror's depths, his body twisting and contorting in impossible ways. By morning, the mansion was silent. The mirror hung on the wall, pristine as ever. Gregory was gone, and the only sign of his presence was a faint smear of blood on the glass. Weeks passed, and the mansion fell into disrepair. Rumors of Gregory's disappearance drawing the attention of paranormal enthusiasts and thrill-seekers. A group of friends decided to explore the mansion, their curiosity outweighing their caution. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they entered the decaying building, their laughter masking their nervousness. The mirror greeted them in the grand hall, its surface unnaturally clean amid the layers of dust and grime. One of the friends, a skeptic named Ben, approached it, running his fingers along the carved frame. "This is it?" he scoffed. "Doesn't look so scary to me." As he spoke, his reflection twisted, its face warping into a grotesque mockery of his own. The others screamed as the mirror's surface rippled like water. And Ben was yanked forward, his body slamming against the glass. His screams were cut short as the mirror absorbed him, leaving only his distorted image trapped inside. Panic set in as the remaining friends tried to flee, but the mansion had become a labyrinth. Doors led to nowhere, hallways looped endlessly, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. The mirror's influence spread, shadows creeping along the walls, whispering in voices that mimicked their own. One by one, the friends fell victim to the mirror's curse. Some were pulled into its depths, their faces joining the countless others trapped in the glass. Others were hunted by their reflections, torn apart by shadowy claws that left no trace of their bodies. By dawn, the mansion was silent once more. The mirror stood alone, its surface gleaming with the faces of its latest victims, their eyes wide with eternal terror. Somewhere, in the depths of the glass, Gregory and Evelyn screamed, their voices lost in the void. The mirror waited, patient and hungry, for its next victim. It all sat empty for months, the air around it heavy with an oppressive stillness. The local townsfolk avoided it, their whispers laced with fear and superstition. Stories of those who entered the mansion, and never returned, spread like wildfire. It became a grim legend, a place spoken of only in hushed tones, but legends, like moths to a flame, attract the reckless. Historian named Dr. Eleanor Price, renowned for her studies on cursed artifacts, learned of the mirror through a local archivist. Intrigued, she dismissed the tales of horror as exaggerated folklore and convinced herself the artifact belonged in a museum. She contacted her assistant, Michael, and arranged an expedition to retrieve it. They arrived late in the afternoon, the mansion looming like a shadow against the dying light. Eleanor's excitement masked her unease, while Michael hesitated, his gut warning him of the dangers within. The front door creaked open, revealing the dust-laden interior and an overwhelming sense of foreboding. As they explored, the mirror drew them in like a predator watching its prey. It sat undisturbed in the grand hall, its surface glowing faintly despite the dim light. Eleanor approached it, her fingers tracing the ornate carvings. The air around her grew icy, and her breath fogged as she stared into the glass. "This is remarkable," she whispered, her reflection perfectly still despite her movements. "Dr. Price." Michael's voice quivered. "I don't think we should be here." Ignoring him, Eleanor leaned closer, captivated by the faint movement within the mirror. Shapes swirled just beneath the surface, shadows that coalesced into twisted faces. One of them looked like Gregory, his features distorted in a silent scream. Her heart raced as the faces multiplied, each one more grotesque than the last. Suddenly, her reflection smiled, a sinister, knowing grin that wasn't hers. Eleanor stumbled back, her mind reeling as the mirror pulsed worldly light. The mansion seemed to respond, the walls groaning as if alive. Michael grabbed her arm. "We have to leave. Now." But the mirror had other plans. The glass rippled like water, and shadowy tendrils burst forth, wrapping around Eleanor's wrists and ankles. She screamed as they dragged her closer, her nails scraping the wooden floor. Michael lunged forward, grabbing her shoulders, but the shadows were relentless. They yanked her into the mirror with a wet, guttural sound, leaving him clutching empty air. "Eleanor!" He shouted, his voice echoing through the empty hall. Her face appeared in the mirror, her eyes wide with terror as she pounded on the glass. Behind her, the distorted figures loomed, their jagged mouths open in silent laughter. Michael's legs gave way, and he collapsed, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. The mirror began to hum, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through the room. Michael's reflection stared back at him, its face twisting into a horrific mockery of his own. The reflection stepped out of the glass, its movements unnatural and jerky. Its eyes burned with a malevolent glow as it lunged at him. Michael ran, his breath ragged and his heart pounding. The hallways stretched endlessly, twisting and warping as the mansion transformed into a nightmarish maze. The sound of his own laughter echoed behind him. Grotesque and mocking, though he hadn't made a sound, he tripped and fell into a room he hadn't seen before. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a version of him that was twisted and mutilated. One mirror showed him with his eyes gouged out, blood streaming down his face. Another showed him as a desiccated corpse, his skin peeling away to reveal the bone beneath. The mirrors began to crack, one by one, releasing shadowy figures that crawled toward him on all fours. Their bodies were misshapen, their limbs bending at impossible angles. Michael scrambled to his feet, his screams drowned out by their guttural growls. He was dragged into the largest mirror, his body disappearing into its depths. The mansion fell silent once more, the air thick with the stench of decay. Weeks later, a group of thrill-seekers broke into the mansion, their cameras rolling as they documented their exploration. They found the mirror in the grand hall, its surface pristine and inviting. One of them, a young woman named Kara, couldn't resist stepping closer. Her reflection smiled. The last thing her friends heard before the lights went out was her blood-curdling scream. Kara's scream echoed through the grand hall, silencing her friends. The air grew dense and suffocating as the temperature plummeted. Shadows slithered along the walls like living creatures. The mirror's surface rippled, its malevolent light reflecting grotesque shapes writhing just beneath the glass. "Kara." Liam, the de facto leader of the group, called out hesitantly. She stood motionless, her hand inches from the mirror's surface, her back turned to them. Her friends exchanged uneasy glances, their unease rapidly escalating to panic. "Kara, are you okay?" Zoe asked, stepping forward cautiously. As Zoe reached out to touch Kara's shoulder, the girl's head snapped around unnaturally, her neck twisting with a sickening crack. Her face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror, her eyes wide and glassy, her lips parted in a silent scream. A distorted laugh erupted from her mouth, not her own but a cacophony of voices, deep, guttural, and otherworldly. The group staggered back in horror. Kara's body convulsed violently before she was thrown forward, her face slamming into the mirror. The glass didn't shatter, instead, it absorbed her, pulling her in like quicksand. She vanished in an instant, leaving behind a faint bloody handprint on the surface. The room erupted into chaos. Liam grabbed Zoe's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We're leaving now," he barked, trembling. The others followed, their footsteps echoing in the vast hall. But as they reached the entrance, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. The sound reverberated through the mansion, shaking the very walls. "Open it!" Zoe screamed, pounding on the heavy oak. But it wouldn't budge. The doorknob twisted and turned, as if taunting them, before locking with a metallic click. Behind them, the mirror began to hum. Its once clear surface grew murky, swirling with an inky blackness that seemed to suck in all light. Liam turned, his eyes widening as shapes emerged from the mirror, twisted, grotesque figures that crawled on all fours, their eyeless faces fixed on the group. The creatures moved unnaturally, their joints bending backward with sickening pops. Their flesh hung in ragged strips, oozing black ichor that hissed and sizzled as it hit the floor. They moved closer, their guttural growls reverberating through the hall. "Run!" Liam shouted, dragging Zoe with him as the group scattered into the dark, labyrinthine corridors of the mansion. The sound of heavy, uneven footsteps followed them, accompanied by a chorus of tortured whispers. Zoe and Liam sprinted down a narrow hallway, the walls seeming to close in around them. Doors appeared on either side, each one leading to a room filled with horrors. One door swung open to reveal Kara, or what remained of her. She hung suspended in midair, her body contorted and twisted, her limbs elongated and broken. Her head lolled to the side, her dead eyes locking onto Liam. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed, her voice layered with 1,000 others. Her body jerked forward as though pulled by invisible strings, her movements marionette-like. Liam yanked Zoe away, slamming the door shut as Kara's distorted face pushed through the wood, her teeth snapping at the air. Elsewhere, another group member, Aaron, found himself trapped in a room lined with reflected a different version of himself, each more horrifying than the last. One reflection grinned as it slit its own throat, blood pouring down the glass. Another clawed at its eyes until they were nothing but gaping holes. "Help me!" he cried, pounding on the door. But the mirrors began to crack, and from each jagged fissure, shadowy hands emerged, reaching for him. They dragged him toward the largest mirror, his screams muffled as he was pulled into its depths. Meanwhile, Zoe and Liam stumbled into what appeared to be the mansion's library. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Books lined the shelves, their pages fluttering as though alive. In the center of the room stood a smaller mirror, its frame identical to the one in the grand hall. It pulsated with a faint, malevolent light. "We have to destroy it," Liam said, his voice trembling. "How?" Zoe asked, tears streaming down her face. Before Liam could answer, the smaller mirror began to glow brighter. Their reflections stepped out, identical but with black, soulless eyes and sinister grins. The reflections moved in unison, stalking toward them. Liam grabbed a heavy book and hurled it at the mirror, but it passed through the glass as if it wasn't there. Their doppelgängers attacked. Liam wrestled with his reflection, their movements mirroring each other. Zoe's double grabbed her by the throat, its grip icy and unyielding. Zoe reached for a jagged piece of glass from a shattered lantern on the floor and plunged it into her reflection's chest. The doppelganger let out an ear-piercing shriek before dissolving into smoke. "Liam!" she screamed, rushing to his aid. Together, they managed to shove his reflection into the smaller mirror. It was sucked back in with a howl, the glass cracking slightly. The room fell silent, but their victory was short-lived. The mansion began to shake violently, the walls cracking as the mirror in the grand hall emitted a shadows poured from its surface, consuming everything in their path. The two barely made it back to the hall, only to see the mirror's true form, a swirling portal of darkness, alive with writhing tendrils and countless screaming faces. Liam grabbed a candelabra and hurled it at the mirror. The flames licked at the frame, and for a moment, the shadows recoiled. Zoe joined in, smashing everything they could find against the cursed artifact. The mirror shrieked, its surface rippling violently. Faces clawed at the glass from the inside, their screams merging into a deafening cacophony. Finally, with a thunderous explosion, the mirror shattered. A wave of darkness swept through the mansion, extinguishing all light. Zoe and Liam were thrown back, their ears ringing as silence fell. When they awoke, the mansion was gone. They lay on the cold, damp ground, surrounded by an empty field where the house once stood. The cursed mirror was no more, or so they thought. Unbeknownst to them, shards of the mirror lay buried in the earth, faintly glowing, waiting for the next victim.